Go ahead, Olivier.
Yes. Hello, everybody. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for giving the opportunity to speak. So we're here today to talk a little bit about CoGhent. Maybe the next slide, Brecht. So CoGhent is a project which is running in Ghent. For people who don't know, Ghent is a city in Belgium, and it's an innovation project which is co-financed by the European Regional Development Fund through the Urban Innovative Actions initiatives. And with our project Collections of Ghent, we want to explore how we can use or leverage digitized cultural heritage to raise social inclusion and enhance social cohesion on a city level. To do that, we will do different interventions in the city, and one of them being that we will create an online platform for active and passive cultural participation that aggregates not only assets from 5 partnering cultural heritage institutions, but also gathers material from the citizens of Ghent. This also will result in an immersive space, which we will call the Handbooks, which will travel to 3 different neighborhoods in the city. Next slide. So one of the challenges that we face in the project is that there's a lot of interoperability among the institutions. This is, of course, that they all have their own registration program or their collection management software, and they all have their own rules, which are historically grown. So we have to tackle both semantic and technical interoperability. And we want to do this or accomplish this by publishing the data as linked open data. We want to do this at the source with a low-cost web interface, which is called a linked data event stream, which we will explain shortly. Besides that, we're also providing a IIIF service because we also want to publish the images that go along with the contextual metadata of the works themselves. And of course, the Handbooks, which will be used as a demonstrator for the technologies that we will implement in the project. Next slide. So we're not doing this alone. It's a big partnership of almost 11 partners. Due to time, I'm not going to read all of them. So next slide.
So yes, I will take over here. This is a broad overview of the different data flows. We're going to talk a lot about data here in this session. So in the left corner below, you can see that the 5 institutions have a CMS system where they can manage their object metadata. And this is like a legacy API using JSON or XML. And so we have an ETL pipeline that transforms that towards linked data. So we're using the CIDOC-CRM metadata model as base for the objects descriptions. And for the technical interoperability, we use a linked data event stream. I will explain that later on. So every institution has its own event stream that describes what has changed in their collection. Now, this can be used in a second phase, which you can see here below. There's the image and presentation metadata. So we offer that for all the institutions and to upload their images so they can be hosted with the IIIF specifications. But the interesting thing is that we harvest the linked data event stream to insert the metadata automatically into the manifests of the objects. So we have an up-to-date key value pair thing in the manifest. And next, on top of that, we re-expose the event stream for every institution, which you can see here. And also other event streams with the IIIF information. So we can use it in a third phase. And that's towards the Handbooks in the immersive space. So that data will be harvested to there. But I will go through this step by step to explain everything in depth. So first, you see here the event streams at the source. What is an event stream is actually the same goal as we have the change discovery API of IIIF. But the goal is to go deeper than the activity stream collection, where we can have multiple fragmentation strategies on top of your data set. Its definition is that you have a collection of immutable objects. This can be a manifest object, but it can also be an activity, like the activity streams, or this can be a thesaurus term version, which you can see here below. You have certain objects, and that object can have multiple versions. And that's what's published on the event stream. So everybody can harvest the latest versions of an object. And we do this by fragmenting this timeline one-dimensionally in time. But event streams can be fragmented in multiple ways. Then after the metadata is plugged in the DAM system, we enrich that event stream with a link to the images and to the manifest. I will quickly show you how this looks like. So when we have a man-made object in CIDOC-CRM, we have a link to its visual item here. And we both use our standard in Flanders. It's called OSLO, which you can see here in yellow, to make the link between the object and the visual item. But we also follow linked art to do that, and also to point to the IIIF image that is used. Same for the IIIF manifest. We go from the object to the digital object that contains the link to the presentation API. And lastly, to show also from the manifest, we link back to the object, to the persistent identifier here that contains JSON LD. So, so at the source, we had linked data event stream with only the base metadata. Then afterwards, this will get enriched with the IIIF links. Now we have also other LDESs we're looking into. For example, an LDES for the IIIF resources, the images and the manifest. So we want to do more than a change discovery because we use the tree specification. You can find the link here. That's actually a way of describing links in a more advanced way in order that intelligent clients can prune these fragments. I have given you some examples. For example, if you fragment in text, you can have a pointer towards letter A, letter B. So the client knows which link to follow and which it doesn't need. Also for time or location-based search, you can use these advanced links. And this is actually the vision behind this, is that event stream belongs in a bigger picture. It's actually the base API, the first API you need to implement if you want to do open data. And on top of this, more advanced APIs can be built, like indexes and querying interfaces. I will go more in depth later. To give an example, if you have an event stream, you can create triple pattern fragments indexes on top of that. The use case for this is graph querying like Sparkle. And also from the event stream to you can actually make a query interface like a Sparkle endpoint. Just demonstrate quickly the triple pattern fragments index. So you can filter on your data set by subject, predicate, object, and then you retrieve all the triples that matches this pattern. So it's a very simple API. And then you can also have the more advanced API where you query a Sparkle endpoint, of course, which we probably all know. You have a Sparkle query, and then you can query over that. But the same idea also applies to search services. Like in IIIF, we have the search API, where you can search over text for a specific resource, which I showed here. But in our vision, we create text indexes. You can create an index for multiple sources and how much you want to combine. And on top of that, other auto-completion APIs can be built. And the main benefit is that you can, your clients, like in your browser, can now query over all these indexes separately. You can choose, I want to query over street names, and kind of search for a name. This is streets in Belgium. You can find the URI for that. But you also want to query over public transport stops in Flanders, or the Thesaurus. There's also one. So next time you search, you see also terms popping up from another text index. And in the background, it does query all the fragments, as you can see here, and follow the links. So that's a different approach. So to give a quick summary what we do in CoGhent, we'll start here at the right side, the blue. So for every institution's objects, its thesaurus terms and agents lists, we expose and link data event stream. Then the green arrow is by Inuits, a company, which harvests this event stream and enriches it with the IIIF manifest and image links. Then in the next phase, these event streams can be harvested by the city themselves, and they offer a Sparkle endpoint over that data. And lastly, we can also create indexes, for example, which we do as IDLab, as a research institution, that others can search over text or with text. So here you can find the specification. Also, we have a catalog. I have enough time. Quickly over it. But the main thing is that it perfectly matches with DCAT as a catalog for data sets. You have an event stream as a data set, which has a link to a distribution, which points to the root node of your fragmentation. This root node contains relations to other documents on the web, and can be described here. And then this node has links to the objects themselves. So you can really follow your nose from a catalog towards the objects themselves. And you can find here the event stream published on this link. So, Olivier?
Yes. So besides that, we're also looking into how people can make narrative frames of the assets or the objects that we provide from the collections, as well as the objects which will be provided by the citizens of Ghent themselves, so they can create like stories or stuff like that. And what we want to do is we want to create this interface. This is a demonstrator of what might be in the CoGhent books. So it will be a 180 arch with screens, and then you will have in the center a frame which is made up of several assets, and these assets themselves contain images as well as their metadata. But we're looking into ways how we can also make these frames, how we can also build them such that it's also built forward on linked data principles, and that can be indexed and also be queried. And so for that, we're building an extra linked data event streams just with these frames. And what we want to do with that, or what we want to accomplish with that, is that these frames in themselves also are linked with other frames. And in that way, you could navigate from one frame to another frame just on basis of, for example, one asset that is in two frames. So in that way, we want to create an interface for the end user through which he can swipe and he can experience cultural heritage on a different way. Next slide. So that's the finality, or one of the finalities of the project, this CoGhent books, so which is basically a demonstrator for the technology behind it, but it's also a way to bring collections or to show them outside of the museum walls and to show them in a different context. Maybe next slide. So this is a teaser. We're still working on this, but this might be how the CoGhent books will look like. So it's kind of a pavilion which will travel around in 3 different neighborhoods in the city of Ghent, going from the center to more the suburbs, and to also participate with or engage with different kind of audiences. Next slide. This is another picture. Next slide. Same. Next slide. And this is basically what it will look like inside. Maybe you can already go to the next slide. So it's a pavilion which inside is has several interfaces. In the center we have a big touch table through which the visitor can really browse through the collection and engage with the collection and also explore it in a graph-based manner. And then the screens or the two arches that are on both sides of the touch table. This is where the frames will be shown, and this is where people can experience their own narrative frames that they can build with the assets we provide. But it's also a way, for example, for a classroom or teacher who can come with her kids or her pupils and to use our assets to tell a story. So we really want to create new dialogues or new kind of ways to engage with the collection and see how people also use our collection outside of the museum. Maybe next slide. And this is still already it's still in development, and what we're doing now. So we have already developed the big or the technical framework, or we have defined the technical framework, and now we are really going to start looking into how this is going to be translated using technology. So from September to January this year, we will have what we call a dev kit, which is also a demonstrator or a developer kit, which will be in the Krook. This is a third place or a library in the city of Ghent, in which we can really test out the technology, but we also want to test this out in a co-creation or a participatory manner, in that way that we will also allow for people to, or for the visitors or for people from Ghent to give feedback on our developments and to really come to the best case scenario, which we would then implement in the CoGhent books, which will have its first iteration starting from January 2022, and then over a time span of 1 year, it will go to the 3 consecutive neighborhoods, to then at the end of the project finally land back into the museum in 2024 in the newly built wing of Design Museum Ghent. So thank you for listening. If there are any questions, we have also put our email addresses on the next slide. Yes.
Yeah, so if there are questions.
Yeah, so we have about 2 minutes, and I think we have 2 questions here. So the first one I saw is, did you consider the IIIF Change Discovery API activity streams pattern for the change event stream?
Yes, of course. And actually our approach is compatible with activity streams. So you can model the collection of an activity stream with the LDES. Actually, you can combine both ways. So it would be about adding the LDES links with activity streams. So, but we want to do more. We see the LDES as a first layer, and you want to build other APIs on top of that. So, and also in different ways, we not just a previous and a next link, but also like text indexes or location indexes, more advanced things like that.
Would help if I unmuted myself. We have one other question / comment. This is the first time I've heard about tree, and I'm not sure I understand the purpose.
About tree, go back. So here was my slide about tree. So maybe some of you know the Hydra vocabulary for web API links. So it's a bit the same, but it's actually qualifying relations, hypermedia relations. Like if you have a link from this document to the other, you can say, if you go towards there, the members of your collection will start with an A, and only that. So you can filter by following links. So that's the purpose. You can, if you have a certain query, I want all the items starting with an A, that you can fragment your data. That you know that the objects starting with an A will be in there and not these others. While with activity streams, you only have a previous and a next link, so you cannot say that.
All right, great. So it looks like we're at time and I need to move on to the next session. Thank you both so much. Such an interesting project to learn about. And thanks to everyone for attending, and just keep an eye out for the recording in the coming weeks. So thanks all, and see you later.
All right, thanks.